Good afternoon and welcome to Reimagining Public Safety, Alternative Ideas for Fundamental Change. Today's event is the second part of our two-part series on reimagining public safety, which convenes national experts for conversations about the challenges of and solutions to police reform in America. And without further ado, here is Carnegie Mellon University alumna, a member of the U.S. House representing Nevada's 3rd District, newly re-elected Congresswoman Susie Lee.
Thank you. It is such an honor for me to be here back with first of all, with this esteemed panel of experts, but also to be with my alma mater. I'm a graduate of 1989 of HNSS at CMU, and then in 1990, it was called the School of Urban and Public Affairs. Back when I attended, which tells you how long ago that was, but it's really a pleasure for me to be here today. And most importantly, talking about reimagining public safety and the ideas for fundamental change. This past year, the national spotlight was again cast upon our criminal justice system after a rash of unjust killings, most notably that of George Floyd. Now, I don't need to tell you that the unequal and unjust treatment of Black Americans is nothing new in this country. And on the contrary, unfortunately, it's a central theme in some of the darker chapters of our nation's history. And it's the same unequal treatment found in our economy, our healthcare system, our housing system, and education that makes things harder for marginalized communities ultimately. And that's ultimately a factor that makes our communities less safe. So it's not a coincidence, and it's a pattern that proves that there's some real systemic issues in this country. And I believe that our way of addressing systemic issues requires a systemic response. And to me, that's the key point that we'll be discussing here today in reimagining public safety. Public safety, to me, is about so much more than the relationship between law enforcement agencies and the communities they serve. It is about how our communities support people and families as a whole. We must recognize the racial and economic inequities. And we know that poverty, which correlates along racial lines, contributes to unemployment, homelessness, lack of access to preventive health care, especially mental health care, and quality schooling, among other issues. And it's coupled with the increasing reduction in the investment in the necessary social services that are needed to support our most marginalized communities. There's studies that prove this. A study shows that in a typical city of over 100,000 residents, every 10 additional organizations that are formed to address violence and build stronger communities result in a 9% drop in the murder rate. Or in Chicago, a study showed that students who took a combination of after-school sports and behavioral health programs were half as likely to be arrested for violent crime. And we know that on average, a dollar invested in preschool education programs returns approximately $7 to the community. Of course, we can debate, and I'm sure many of these experts have, the ultimate mix of investment in programs like these, but they all point to one fact, that supporting our communities makes them safer. And right now, we have a public safety system that prioritizes criminal justice as a remedy for things like mental illness, substance abuse, and homelessness. But if our ultimate goal is safety, our first response should be to help those who are struggling the most, not to criminalize or control them. The best way to do that, in my opinion, is to support real public safety is to invest in social services and resources that people need. That includes mental health services, drug treatment, social work, education, especially early childhood education and housing. Because the best remedy for substance abuse is drug prevention and treatment. The best cure for mental illness is mental health care. And ultimately, we must recognize the impact of intergenerational poverty on the trajectory for most people if we are to devise public policy around public safety. I want to be clear, crystal clear, because this was obviously an issue throughout our campaign, that I do not support defunding police, but I fully believe that we need a strong local public safety to prevent crime and catch the real bad guys. But they're also they're a key component in keeping our communities safe. But as such, we also need to invest in key training and community outreach. What is also clear is the full weight of public safety cannot fall entirely on the shoulders, because the truth is we're doing both our law enforcement and our citizens a disservice when we ask local police officers to act as our mental health professionals, our social workers, our housing specialists, and our trauma experts. It's not realistic, and it leads to suboptimal outcomes and unnecessary violence, and obviously not in the best public interest of best public safety. Something that makes me incredibly hopeful around this conversation is that I've seen broad agreement on this point across the spectrum, from law enforcement to community activists. This past year, given we passed the Justice in Policing bill, I had a chance to reach out to my local constituents, our Black community leaders, law enforcement in Southern Nevada, and talk about the glaring deficiency in our public safety system. And they're all in agreement that we do need change. They want funding for mental health care. They want funding for social work and drug treatment. And as a legislator, to me, that is critical, because to create change and turn these ideas into policy, the government must invest in communities to control, rather than control and criminalize them, which is really the true result of a lack of investment. Now, these investments, even though these investments will work to improve public safety, it would not magically solve the unjust treatment of people, most especially those of color in our criminal justice system. It wouldn't magically end the killings of Americans like George Floyd. And for that problem to end, it's all about accountability. Law enforcement needs to be held accountable if they operate in a way that's unequal or unjust. And we hear it all the time. It's not the system, it's just a few bad apples. And I understand that sentiment, especially from police officers, many who I know who are good, upstanding officers. However, if bad apples exist and there's a pattern that seems to keep repeating itself, it's a problem within the system, because a functioning policing system should have accountability measures in place to root out those bad apples. And too often, police departments across the country are allowed to investigate their own, and often have eliminated accountability standards that would provide the necessary checks and balances. And this is a problem that cannot be fixed with federal policy alone. It must also happen at the state and local level. That includes solutions like universal body cams, smarter, more effective police training, and internal affairs system that hold officers accountable. So we're all here for the same reason, because we know there's a public safety problem in our country. And although it has manifested itself in our policing system, we know it's not just about police. Obviously, there's not just one solution to this, which is why this forum like today is so incredibly important. I'm grateful to be part of this conversation. I will be tuning out on video, but listening in. So I thank you again for having me here for this incredibly important conversation. And I must say, it is one of the things I appreciated so much about Carnegie Mellon and the Heinz School, was bringing together experts to take on these incredibly complex problems that face our country and our communities. So before I end, I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Ben Chapman, who covers criminal justice for the Wall Street Journal in New York City. And previously, he reported on education for the New York Daily News and wrote about travel for the Washington Post. So I will now turn it over to Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. I will now introduce our panelists. First, Lori Robinson is a professor of criminology, law, and society at George Mason University. Lori has spent more than 3 decades working on national criminal justice policy. She served as an assistant attorney general in both the Clinton and the Obama administrations. And in 2014, she was named by President Obama to co-chair the White House Task Force on 21st century policing. The recommendations produced by that task force are viewed as a seminal set of principles that are guiding ideas for departments around the country today. Next, we have Philip Atiba Goff. Philip is co-founder and CEO of the Center for Policing Equity and a professor of African American Studies and Psychology at Yale University. In his scholarly work, Phil has quickly become a national leader in the science of racial bias by pioneering scientific experiments that have exposed how our minds learn to associate Blackness and crime implicitly. Third is Nick Turner. He is president and director of the Vera Institute of Justice. Under Nick's leadership, Vera is pursuing core priorities of ending the misuse of jails, transforming conditions of confinement, and ensuring that justice reforms more effectively serve America's growing minority communities. Nick's writing has been widely published, and he previously served as managing director of the Rockefeller Foundation. Finally, we have Daniel Nagin. Daniel is a professor of public policy and statistics at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College. He is the incoming president of the American Society of Criminology, and his writing on policing has been widely published as well. Daniel is also the recipient of the Stockholm Prize on Criminology, and he served as chair of the National Academy of Sciences panel on the deterrent effect of the death penalty. So those are our panelists today. And I'd like to begin the conversation by asking each of our panelists a question that is vital to the dialogue of reimagining public safety in our nation. Lori, let's start with you. Lori, in your role as co-chair of President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, what are two of the recommendations that were created in the task force that are, in your view, most important for having the most significant impact on policing and public safety in the United States today?
Oh, well, thank you, Ben. And the first thing I would note is that when President Obama established the task force, as you referenced in the introduction, the charge that he gave to Chuck Ramsey, my co-chair, Chuck was the Philadelphia Police Commissioner at the time, the charge he gave us was to look at what were effective bridges that could be built between law enforcement and communities. And what strikes me in thinking about the 5.5 years that have passed since our report came out is how much the conversation has really broadened since that time, primarily because of the time that has passed since George Floyd's tragic death last summer, the protests that grew up since that time, and the national conversation, as evidenced by this panel, about rethinking broadly public safety in this country. Because when our report came out in early 2015, our task force proposals were really viewed as quite bold. But I think with the broadened conversation today, they might even seem somewhat moderate. But to get to your question, the first recommendation I would point to is very key that could have a real impact is our call for embracing a guardian mindset rather than a warrior mindset in law enforcement. And the idea here, of course, is that police should not be like an occupying force in a community. They should be protectors and guardians of the residents. And this is actually a concept that goes back to Plato's notion that guardians are the people who are chosen to have responsibility for protecting the democracy. Now, there are certainly times when police need to be warriors, For example, in dealing with a violent hostage situation, just to take one illustration. But we know from research actually conducted by my colleague Nick Turner's Vera Institute of Justice that these kind of very serious violent crimes constitute a very small percentage of a police department's caseload. And one note here about how this kind of change needs to be addressed in part, and that is that too many police academies are still organized really as military style boot camps that emphasize a warrior approach. So a refocus not only on education in the academies, but throughout police training over the course of officers' careers, I think is important to really pitch toward a guardian approach. My second recommendation would be to point to our proposal regarding community policing. And here we went far beyond what I would call the traditional notion of kind of officer-friendly patrolling and walking a neighborhood beat. What we called for was a police department to approach kind of co-producing public safety with members of a community as a partnership. And what we said here was to work with the community in jointly identifying problems and then jointly identifying and collaborating on solutions. So you would not end up with a stop and frisk situation, for example, as occurred in New York, where the residents felt it was really encroaching on the safety of the residents in a bad situation. So these kind of partnerships, I think we need to recognize, are really going to have to be built on a foundation of trust. And we recognize that this is not a short-term process. It's not going to be an easy process. It's going to be something where relationships have to be built and they have to be nurtured. So it's going to take a lot of hard work and it's certainly not going to happen overnight.
Thank you very much, Lori. Nick, a lot of people have been talking about defunding the police and the discourse around public safety in the United States. And reforming the police has become somewhat of a weighted term. What do you make of that? And what do you think is the right approach to delivering public safety in America?
Ben, thank you for that question. And Representative Lee really spoke to that in her beginning remarks. Let me begin by saying that this notion of sort of defund the police, it's a provocative word that's drawn strong reaction. And what's important to understand is that it really masks a range of thinking from abolitionist thought around dismantling policing entirely to divesting or shrinking the footprint of law enforcement and investing in other needed or underinvested areas and services. So, but people tend to get hung up on both, the timing and the absolutism that seems to be associated with defund. So what, do all of it now? And in fact, it's, the problem with that reaction is that it really obscures, a very serious observation that's implicit in the notion of defund, which is that we over rely on law enforcement to deliver public safety, and have historically been, I guess I would sort of say, like painfully unimaginative or willfully blind about the other things that deliver public safety and that deliver strong communities. That includes public health systems that work, that serve people who have mental health needs or who are substance abusing or respond to crisis, or the kind of civic infrastructure and nonprofit infrastructure that you'd want to see in strong communities. So, put another way, we overinvest in these systems of oppression and underinvest in those of opportunity. And so, one of the things that I would hope is that if nothing else, people reframe their thinking around defund and ask a different question, which is, are we investing in and and then correctly diversified in the right things to deliver true public safety for everyone? And my answer to that is no. And so it makes sense to, that we seriously think about the redistribution of resources to other systems. And so let me just share a few facts to make that case. I mean, right now in America, we spend $115 billion at the local and state level on policing alone, which is bigger than a number than some countries spend on their military. And when you look at cities, and Vera has done this, we did an analysis of budget data from 70 of the biggest cities around the country this summer. It's not unusual to see them spending 30 or 40% of their discretionary budgets on law enforcement. I'll give you one example. Charlotte, North Carolina, spends 39% of its discretionary budget dollars. That's almost $300 million a year on law enforcement. So you might ask, well, how does that compare to what it spends on other things? So let's look at another city. Let's take Oakland, for example. A study was done about 3 years ago that showed that for every $1 spent on policing, Oakland spent 11 cents on parks and recreation, 8 cents on housing and community development, and 29 cents on human services. So there's a sort of a massive problem with the distribution of public resources for the services that communities need to be safe, healthy, and secure. Now, some people might say, well, Nick, that's fascinating, but I'm sure there are a lot of homicides and shootings to tackle. And so I bet that distribution of resources makes sense. And as Lori just said a moment ago, so Vera did some research that shows that it actually doesn't make sense. Every year in America, we did a study, we looked at all of the data across the country. There are like about 10.5 million arrests a year. That's one every 3 seconds. So there was an arrest just now, and there was another arrest just now. And they're not for homicides and violent crime. In fact, 5% of those arrests are for violent crime, and 80% are for what I would describe as non-serious, low-level offenses that are linked to poverty and homelessness and mental illness. And there's another study that was done by the New York Times wrote about the study that looked at 3 cities, and it showed that officers in cities spend 4% of their time addressing violent crime, and over half of their time addressing traffic and non-criminal matters. So we're overinvesting in a resource that is, that essentially is organized around sort of overreach and over-enforcement and over-criminalization, and impoverishing the systems that we need for healthier communities. So the question around divest and invest is incredibly important. The last thing that I want to say on this matter is why it really matters is I think about Eric Garner, and we all know that Eric Garner, when he died, he said, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." I remember very well what he said in the moments before that. And what he said in the moments before that is like, "Why are you always on me? Why are you constantly harassing me?" This is what he said to the police, who were intervening in his life because he was selling loosies. He was selling a single cigarette on the street, which is a violation of New York City tax code. And that incident ended up in his death. And so when you think about the overreach of the police and the fact that 80% of what they're enforcing are low-level offenses, poverty, homelessness, and mental illness, and you have to realize that every one of those encounters has a risk of bodily injury or death. And so it's not just Eric Garner, it's George Floyd, who was called, the police came up on him because he was allegedly passing counterfeit $20 bill. Or Philando Castile, who had a broken tail light allegedly in his car. So I think that this is a really important issue. People should not get stuck on defund and should think about it from the perspective of, are we investing wisely as a society in the things that all communities need to thrive?
Thanks a lot, Nick. I appreciate that. Thanks for sharing. Phil, given Nick's comments on some of the challenges of reimagining public safety and the sort of disconnect between our structures as we have them in place now and where Nick thinks they should go. What do you think are some of the most important strategies for making fundamental changes to our systems that we have in place today?
So it's difficult for me to answer that question until we decide what set of changes we're trying to make, right? So you started by asking Lori what are the two things that she felt like were most important moving forward. And I'm struck by the fact that as we're having this conversation, there are really two diagnoses that are dominant in what's wrong with race in policing right now. One diagnosis is that we see the oppression and the death that is unceasing, and the numbers seem never to go down nationally, even as they go down in cities that are working their hardest at it. And the reason for that is because we haven't gotten the right professionalism. There's loose managerial controls, it's bureaucratic, there's too many mistakes. And the set of solutions that you see for that, it's incredibly difficult to work inside of a system that's not used to having external oversight, that is generally distrustful of outsiders, to reform from inside that system. It takes incredible effort to do internal reform, which is what reform has come to mean. But the second diagnosis is that really the mission is what's wrong. This is not a bug, it's a feature. And so if what you're trying to do then is to dismantle, to abolish, or to right size, any version of that, the set of direct solutions are incredibly different. It's not about tighter managerial controls. It's about figuring out the right kinds of arguments and the right kinds of mechanisms of local political power to reduce the size. Those different solutions require very different strategies. And so what I would say we're in the midst of trying to find out right now is whether or not those two diagnoses, I can say they don't have to be in tension, but often the people who have adopted them are. So is it possible to live in a world where both those diagnoses coexist, or do they need to be in tension until one gives way to the other in terms of priority? And if we've decided that they can live at the same time and that both are necessary and vital, how do you engage in internal reform that doesn't get in the way of the ultimate goal of reducing the footprint of punishment and increasing the resources to prevent punishment in the first place, prevent that as the necessary response? So for questions on strategy, I gotta say, I don't know. And I think that I say that not because I'm unprepared for the question, but because I think especially right now, after the last 4 years of whatever the heck it is that we've come through, I tip of the cap to whatever historian names this era. I think that we should embrace the idea of intellectual humility. I don't think a lot of people saw the last 4 years coming, and I think it's going to be difficult to predict what happens next. So with that, I say I don't know what the strategies could or should be, but I will say this. As someone who studied social movements and studied reform and abolition within other social sectors, I'll say that the most effective strategies are ones that are clear in goal, clear in tactic, and maintain a coalition of like-minded people who have a divergence of views about those tactics. It's going to be very difficult for us to sustain attention on public safety, much less change in public safety, if we're cannibalizing the folks who are just a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left of us. And that's not to minimize the need for actual thorough and deep engagement, but it is to say that at this moment, when we've seen a kind of intensity around public safety that we didn't see after Ferguson. I don't know how many people remember 2014 through 2016, but the intensity around public safety pales in comparison to this moment, right? But at this moment, when there are resources and attention flooding in, we will not be able to sustain that momentum if the only fights we're having are around tactics as opposed to clarifying goals and strategies, which is to say, I both don't know, and it's really important for all of us to figure out a way for a majority of the folks who care a lot about this and agree on the goals to get on the same page.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it. Really fascinating points. I'd like to go to Dan next. And a lot of Dan's work focuses on the idea that building community trust must have co-equal status with crime prevention in facilitation of public safety. And this seems to be an idea that's underpinning sort of much of our discussion here, and a lot of the discussion around public safety generally. In that context, Dan, what are a couple of the most important things that we should be doing or focusing on to reimagine public safety in America right now?
Thank you Ben, for the question. A lot of what I'm going to say is going to echo what Lori said in her introductory comments. So let me begin by saying, I want to first comment on the premise of the question you asked, Ben. Police serve many functions. Among the most important is public safety and crime prevention. But another, in my view, that is equally as important is securing community trust and confidence. Some have argued that this objective operates in the service of the crime prevention objective. That may or may not be the case, but I'll point out that securing community trust and confidence is important in its own right. It's an important objective in its own right. Now here I'm going to echo again what Lori said. If the police are viewed as an occupying force, not a trusted partner, that is a social cost in and of itself, regardless of whether confrontational policing tactics are effective in preventing crime. And I think here, case in point was the use of stop, question, and frisk in New York City. There's been much controversy about its effectiveness in preventing crime and the legality of its application. But it seems that lost in all of this was consideration simply of the social cost of the indignity of millions of innocent citizens being forcefully stopped and frisked under the pretense that they might be carrying a weapon. To answer your question directly, how then can the objective of securing community trust be given co-equal status with crime prevention? This brings me, my response to the basics of running any organization, whether it's policing or otherwise. And here again, I think Phil has a lot of experience with this, is that desired behaviors must be rewarded and undesirable behaviors must be discouraged. Concerning the undesirable behaviors, much has already been written and said about preventing unwarranted use of police force. And I don't have anything more to add to that except that such reforms are imperative. But as for rewarding desired behavior, a necessary first step in doing that is devising fine-grained systems for regularly measuring community trust in the police, including individual officers. No such system of measurement presently exists, but they're necessary for constructing systems that reward officers who are successful in fulfilling the mission of community trust with tangible awards such as promotion and intangible acknowledgements. Such awards are necessary for embedding public trust as a core tenet of police culture. Thus, my bottom line is that you can't reward what you can't measure. And more fundamentally, community trust cannot be constructed unless we measure it in a regular way and reward those police officers who are playing an active role in building it. And I'll close out by making actually a specific pitch to Representative Lee that the federal government can play a leading role in developing these systems for measuring community trust. I would say based probably not on regular polls. The last election, I think clearly showed us some of the limitations of that, but another approach to measuring it is to develop measures of community trust based on social media and feed. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Dan. I appreciate your comments there. And at this time, I'd like to invite all of our panelists to turn on their videos to engage in a group conversation to further discuss the topic. So Dan, in his comments, stated that he believes the federal government can play a leading role in rethinking public safety. And so my first question to the panelists would be that with a new administration coming into place, what recommendations would each of you make to the new administration about what we should be doing about public safety and policing? Lori?
Oh, well, even though we know with 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies that the main action in policing is at the state and local level, federal leadership in law enforcement is very vital, particularly in driving change. And I'll just offer very quickly a few examples from the past. And by the way, this goes across both Democratic and Republican administrations. Look back at the Johnson administration back in the 60s with the Johnson Crime Commission and its very highly respected chapter on policing, which really looked into the future. Look at the Reagan administration and its National Institute of Justice director, Chip Stewart, who started the Harvard Executive Session series on policing and what it did in really kicking off a lot of thinking about community policing. Then, of course, President Obama with the task force that we've discussed on 21st century policing. So what recommendations for the Biden administration incoming? I think clearly President Biden could do a great deal in pulling together under the White House aegis a broad group of people to look at not just policing, but the kind of broad public safety discussion that we're having here today. A broad group to look comprehensively in the way all of us, I think, are thinking about it here. And then beyond that, to think about the levers of the federal government and what it is they could do. And I'll talk very briefly about the Justice Department, which I know best, whether it's the Civil Rights Division to again resurrect the pattern or practice suits that have not been brought in the current administration, and then the Office of Justice Programs, which I had headed with, and the COPS office, with not only grant money, but convenings of people from around the country to share examples of what is working and what is not. The research arm, the National Institute of Justice, to really evaluate and test and share examples of what is working. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, of course, for data collection, and demonstration projects through the Bureau of Justice Assistance to really test what is working and what isn't, and to, again, share that information. The federal government is vital for that role.
Just to fill in with Lori's discussion of the kind of research that needs to be done, and to return to my comments on this. I think that there needs to be a major federal investment in devising systems for, as I spoke before earlier, of measuring in a very granular way and practical way community trust. And that data has to be brought into the used within policing organizations to reward officers who build and advance community trust. And to do that, we need systems to devise those systems of rewards, which I think is probably just the kind of thing that the COPS office, for example, could do. And in terms of building these methods, which I think should be based on social media for measuring community trust, that probably should be a joint effort of the National Institute of Justice and the National Science Foundation.
Thanks, Dan. Nick or Phil?
Yeah, I'll hop in. It's not a surprise that I agree with my colleagues. Lori talking about the ways in which NIJ and BJA should be supporting these efforts. I am not surprised to hear her say it, and I am pleased to co-sign. I'd also, though, like to caution all of us in our language around how we support these kinds of initiatives. I'm someone who works in the academy, and I work in activist spaces. And just the last week, I've had 3 or 4 conversations where I'm a data guy. Like the hashtag that we've got trademarked is Justice Nerds for the Center for Policing Equity. And I talk about the need for data to chart a path forward so that we know, hey, when we do this, we're able to keep street crime down and we lower the footprint of policing. Everybody is winning in that space. And in the past, I think it's a fair criticism to say that asking for more data and more quality analysis before we make the change has been asymmetric. We've made changes in law enforcement for more sort of harsh, punitive, law and order style law enforcement with no evidence that it works whatsoever. And we've got communities that are tired of waiting for these systems to get better and align with their values and to stop taking away their community members. So while I am absolutely eager, and the things I was going to say, Lori has said better than me, right? I want more funding for research to demonstrate that what communities believe will keep them safe actually works, right? Nick did a wonderful job of summarizing a lot of those stats. I want Patrick Sharkey to be able to cite to, and it's these programs that work specifically this well. I want that for us because I think that allows us to take the folks who are worried that this direction is unsafe and make them feel comfortable. Right, which is necessary for long-term sustainable change. But I don't want us to articulate those desires in such a way that the need for data and analysis is in the way of change, because it's never in the way of regression. And I don't mean that in the statistical way, excuse me. It's never in the way of regressing, right, of moving backwards. It's never in the way of punishing Black folk. We don't need data to punish Black folks and vulnerable communities more. But then we insist on data to get ourselves out of that. I think those things are different. So the caveat of the friendly amendment I would offer to all of this is that BJA, OJP, all of the systems that where they should have a statue of Lori somewhere in the hallways, they should be giving money to community groups and resources and researchers to community groups to demonstrate that the wisdom of those communities bears out in science. Because too often what I do as someone who gets to be a respected scientist is I prove nothing except for what my grandmother told me several generations ago, what she knew. But we weren't listening to her because her evidence was just her experience. Mm-hmm. And I think communities are tired of their experience not counting as much as the evidence that external researchers are able to provide for them. So I am pro data. How could I be otherwise? But I want us to be cautious in our messaging around that, because too often it has been used to delay the change that communities have already known that they need.
So clearly President-elect Biden should listen to Phil's grandma. That would be the right first step. I think we all know that. Let me just sort of add a few very quick points here. I mean, I think one thing that this new administration can do is adopt a principle of do no harm. And there's a bunch of low-hanging fruit that can be, there's and I don't remember the name of the program, but the transfer of military equipment to police departments should come to an end.
Yeah, the 1033 program.
1033. That's exactly. It was right on the tip of my tongue, Lauren. Yeah. And then we can reinstate the power of the Civil Rights Division to expand investigations into police departments and pattern and practice. So those are sort of like easy, low-hanging things. I think on the money that goes through the Office of Justice programs, there's an opportunity to think about what that incentivizes and whether there's a way of shifting the incentive, because the federal government influences a lot of local action and policy practice through the requirements of what it means to take that grant money. So is there a possibility to shift that in some regard, whether, as Phil says, to shift it so that money only comes from the Bureau of Justice Assistance or OJP, if there is a true partnership with community, or if community takes the lead in these things. And then I think in the long term, what I would love to see is that the federal government provides help to localities to think about, and Phil knows this stuff far better than I will, so I'm going to say a quick word and then I'm going to be quiet about it, on 911 dispatch, and how we can, 240 calls go to 911 every year. And I think for the most part, those calls get distributed to the fire department, to the police department, and then maybe to crisis response in a very small, that is not, first responder as we know it. That's in a minority of places. And so how do we help jurisdictions, redo the plumbing on 911 so that we are diverting calls that the police, in the statistics that I shared, do not need to be handling?
Yeah. Can I just...
And the federal government help to invest in those systems so that they're built up. So that's what I would like to see in the long term.
Yeah. Can I just add one other word? I think that if there's one thing that we collectively would agree on, there are many things, but make a central recommendation out of this panel, if we can say that on this federal point, is that to recommend that the federal government strongly suggest a big effort on encouraging localities to collect the data and study the potential for reinventing their 911 triage process, because this has to be locally driven. So Phil, it goes to your point about engaging the community, and Nick, to your point, really about the reinvention and the work that Vera has done. But it really strikes me, since reading your study, that this is so fundamental to beginning the process where it needs to start. And Phil, looking at the data, but it also is looking at the lived experience of people in those communities and what is actually going on.
Thanks a lot, Lori. And as you mentioned, a lot of this has to be locally driven. And with that in mind, I'd like to ask the panelists, what are some of the most exciting or significant developments that you've seen in cities around the country as they're responding to the intensity around public safety that we're seeing today?
Ben, I'm happy to jump in. We're seeing a lot around the country. I want to begin by asserting that this is a long game. So what we are seeing, in the last few months, what we'll see in this administration, all good, but we need to be thinking about a decades-long endeavor. And let me sort of bang the gong on, there's a lot of things that, that jurisdictions have done around, banning chokeholds and, and expanding the capacity to investigate fairly misconduct and things of that nature. But what I really sort of want to bang the gong on is what I describe as budget justice, because I really think that this matters. Budgets, and you heard me go through this sort of litany of statistics about the money that we spend on law enforcement. Budgets are moral documents. They are practical documents. And one of the things that Vera has been doing is try to shed some light on city budgets, which we've done. And we've then gone out and done webinars with local leaders and both in government, city council members, and then citizen activists. And I want to read a quote from one city council member that I think is just incredibly powerful and speaks to the power of the police to maintain their budgets. And that's a whole different conversation around political power and power of unions and things of that, and and just the difficulty of this issue as a wedge issue. But he said, the burden typically falls on government agency to justify to us, he's a legislator, a city council member, that they're worth it. Are they picking up the garbage, educating our kids, delivering the mail? Yet somehow with police, it's the opposite. They're the only agency where the burden is on us, not them, to justify why we might ever consider cutting their budget or even keeping it the same. And so that, there's a lot to unpack there. That is gospel as we're seeing it around the country. But I will also say that we are seeing some very positive steps. I'm going to give a few quick examples. We are seeing in cities around the country, Milwaukee, Oakland, Denver, Portland, Charlottesville, Virginia, Rochester, New York, Winona, Minnesota, cities that are saying, we actually don't want to contract anymore with the local police to be in our schools. So we're going to end those contracts. We're seeing some cities have the police get out of traffic enforcement. We're seeing some cities set up, crisis response mechanisms and new agencies, Albuquerque, St. Petersburg, San Francisco, and Berkeley. And then in the most recent election, we saw Los Angeles voters vote to approve something called Measure J, which essentially said that the county has to dedicate 10% of its general, of its discretionary money to care first, to the services that people need to be safe and healthy, not to law enforcement. So it's a powerful statement of the affirmative need. So I think that there's a growing tide. There's a lot of progress. But what all of those things say is that in trying to make sure that all of our communities are safe and secure and healthy, and allow for productivity, we got to be looking well beyond law enforcement. We have to shrink the footprint of law enforcement. And if we're trapped in law enforcement delivers public safety, we're going to be trapped in the same vortex we've been trapped in for decades.
Thanks, Nick. Phil, I saw you nodding vigorously there. Do you have anything you wanted to add?
That's just the Pavlovian response whenever Nick starts talking. But yeah, when he read the quote, I literally just yesterday had a conversation with someone who it had dawned on them where their Department of Public Health has to every year come with a huge stack of charts and graphs explaining this is why you need to fund us. People die when you don't. And she said, but every conversation with the police is like, you're going to die. Give us money. It feels like it's a cartel kind of jack. And as people are waking up to that distinction, which by the way has been going on for years, it's not like that's new, but people are waking up that it doesn't have to be that way. That's what reimagining looks like. So I'm with Nick. I had a list of those same kinds of, I would just add to that, that Indianapolis is doing a great job of saying, you know what? We keep all of our data in silos, and that means that we have no idea when the person we just arrested could have been prevented from being in that system from the 17 different social services we have. We integrate the systems, we catch them before we have to catch them, right? And in Ithaca, where they're doing a partnership between the city and the county, where they're looking at reforming all of it and saying, what this should be is not a department that doles out, that metes out punishment, but a department that identifies people in crisis and provides for them the set of resources they need to be out of crisis before we get called. So the most promising things to me are in those cities, but the most promising kinds of interventions are not policing interventions. They're not police reforms. Universal basic income is really exciting. And it dawned on me as we were having this conversation about a week ago, where we've talked a lot about focused deterrence. I know all of the folks on this panel have looked at the ways in which focused deterrence clearly reduces the footprint of law enforcement, and it identifies folks who are most violent from the community. Why on earth have we never investigated, have we never studied focused UBI, focused universal basic income in the places that are most vulnerable? Why not give them the resources instead of the punishment? So the rethinking of the logic that people need to be held accountable for their choices, we don't hold society accountable for the options that we give them, is ludicrous. And I'm really excited that there is a generation of engaged young people who's coming up and learning to resist that on its face. And if we can hold together the fact that just imagining that new place is not quite the same thing as a plan, and that we've also been doing this work to get us to this point for several generations, just that the old people don't need to be out on an ice floe. I really think that that's an exciting space to be moving in, where the best thing happening in a city around policing is a new grocery store. The best thing happening in a city is, like Scott Thompson used to say, the new Boys and Girls Club, which he'll take over 10 new officers any day. The best thing happening in public safety is the public being safe and not needing an armed response to their crises.
So Phil, I wanted to go back to your comments at the top of the conversation when I asked you about strategies for change. And you said that we need to talk about goals first before strategies, and then you talked a little bit about goals. But I'd like you to build on that a little bit if you could.
Yeah, and so we're at this point where, I mean, you're hearing each of us do a negotiation around it. I've never had an experience like the last several months where when I'm on panels with my sort of travel companions in this space, we've needed to stake out where we are in the space. We were just like, yeah, bad policing is bad. We should have it better. And that was easy. That was a given. So we would talk about the specific programs. So it's not the case that there is uniform agreement on what better looks like, on what the ultimate goal looks like. There are folks on that, and I'm not needing anybody to say so, but there are folks in this conversation, I've checked the Q&A, who feel like law enforcement is underinvested in and communities are kept safe by the folks who respond there. And by the way, a majority of Black folks in Black communities agree with that position, that law enforcement is part of what keeps us safe. And if that means more money, God bless them. There are folks who genuinely believe that when we get this right, there will be nothing like law enforcement at all, that violence interruption will be led by communities and the kinds of training and tools that are available will be entirely nonviolent. And then there are folks who land within a spectrum around that. I think that there are some unifying principles, and Center for Policing Equity has been using some of those principles to define how we're growing, evolving, and mostly just accelerating the work that we do. And the first principle is that every community is better when they don't feel like they have to call the police. Anybody want to live in a community, would like to move from where you are to a community where they feel like they have to call the police more, right? Like that seems ludicrous. So less crisis is good. And we know that takes resources, individual resources and public resources. That's the first principle. Second principle is when you do have a crisis, the public's responsibility should be to provide appropriate services. That means if my crisis is homelessness, why would you send someone with a set of tools for substance abuse, right? If my crisis is substance abuse, why are you sending a badge and a gun? And if my crisis is mental health and it's suicide, for sure, why are you sending a badge and a gun? That makes no sense. If my crisis is homelessness, send a roof and 4 walls. If it's substance abuse, send treatment. If it's mental health, right, send counseling. So when I call 911, instead of having one of 3 different vehicles, cop car, ambulance, right, fire truck, have other resources available so that they are appropriately matched to the right kind of crisis. And that should drive how the public invests in public safety. Those 2 principles get us a long way. There is a third principle that I think it's important to articulate, which is not universally held, but we at CPE do, which is that whatever we're doing with the systems that exist should not impede our journey to where we're trying to go. Right? And if that means where we're trying to go is a place with a dramatically smaller footprint of law enforcement, then we can't produce systems that make it easy for law enforcement to argue they need to be larger. Right? This is the place where I think that some activists have legitimate critiques of, for sure, some forms of reform. And some forms of reform are, in fact, a kind of complex, where money goes in and it goes back to the department and then it goes back to either the nonprofit or the contractor. And that can be in the way if the goal is to shrink the footprint. So this idea of not being used as a shield against what communities are asking for, or an off-ramp towards a final destination, that's the third value or goal that I think we can all, or principle we can all, hopefully we can all agree with. All of this, and this will be where I dismount from, Ben, your question, all of this is within this context, and I saw this in the chat as well. It is a little bit assumed by this panel, and I know it's assumed in a deep way in the way we live our lives, but it can't go unremarked upon that one of the most peculiarly efficient tools of racial oppression in the history of the world is state public safety apparatus, right? It just is. And so in this context, we got to stand up, say that, and then resist it. That doesn't mean that individual officers are all individually bigoted. That comes from a deeply unsophisticated understanding of how racism functions and racial oppression functions. But we got to say out loud that anytime there's either the intent or the negligence to allow to happen so large-scale racial hierarchy and stratification and oppression, they use the state to do it, and the violence purveyors that come from the state are used peculiarly well to make that happen. We should all be interested in lining up to prevent that from happening and to prevent it from creating systems that allow it to happen outside of our awareness moving forward.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks very much to all the panelists there. I'd like to move on to some of the live questions that our audience has been submitting. First, I'd like to go to a question from Wanye W, who asks, what are some of the obstacles to structural changes in criminal justice or policing reform? Wanye mentions one low-hanging fruit is a national database of police officers, current and former, so that persons who were fired from one police force for severe misconduct don't get hired for another police force, which seems like a common sense idea. Yet even that seems unachievable. So Wanye asked, why is that? If you guys could talk about that, I'd appreciate it. Lori?
Lori.
I think that the central reason, Wanda or Wanye, why proposals like that or generally change in policing in this country is so challenging, and I think we've touched on this, is that there are 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies in this country. It's a vastly decentralized system. And one other little factoid here, half of those agencies, 9,000, consist of 10 or fewer sworn officers. So you have so many very, very small agencies out there. And so when you get to something, for example, your question on having a central location or central kind of registry of officers who have been fired for specifically for severe misconduct. I don't think you want to include people who've been fired because they came into work late or those kinds of things. But even that, and there have been efforts to compile that, and there is a registry of that kind, but it's very incomplete. The reason is that there's not a national control of policing, which is a system with our federal system that has been specifically something that we have approved over the years and supported. But for a need of this kind, and to change that, we would really need stronger support from the states, because states do have control over their local law enforcement agencies. I think there is growing support for attention to that, and some of the proposals before Congress would really address this in a stronger fashion. But at the end of the day, states need to come behind this. One other factor I would mention too is the strong or the strength of police unions, which have by and large resisted this kind of registry.
Thanks, Laurie. Anybody else? Okay, I'd like to move on to another question from the audience that sort of feeds nicely into what Laurie was just talking about, which is the differences that, the fact that we have 18,000 different local departments, and that they are come with different resources, different challenges, different orientations. And the audience member asks, given the contrast, the fact that small cities are very different than large city police forces, can any of you offer any advice on how to look at balancing act for these situations? Maybe Laurie, you have a couple quick, or anyone else?
Well, I would just jump in and say, the research actually tells us that some of the smaller jurisdictions have more problems with police issues in their departments than larger jurisdictions. And in some ways, that's not surprising, in that larger police departments have more resources. They have the ability to have crime analysis units, to have special training units. And just as an example, in the area of handling offenders with mental illness, many of them have done the crisis intervention training. It's not perfect, but it has, statistically, it's been shown in some of the research, helped to decrease problems with fatalities or other issues in those cases, and that has not been true with smaller or medium-sized urban areas. So I think, at least from the research standpoint, we have some understanding that there are challenges in those smaller departments.
Thanks.
I'd like to build on what Lori just said. Is in my own research on police use of lethal force, is that what that research shows is that that instances, corrected for population size, of police use of lethal force is greater, not smaller, in smaller departments. And so that, and also in rural areas as well. And there are a variety of potential explanations for that. But going back to, again, returning to Lori's point about there being 18,000 police departments in the country, and most of them very small, is that I think one important structural reform that we need to see happen, and this again would have to happen at the state level, is consolidation of these departments into larger entities so that they have the resources to do the kind of training, investigations. There's a whole variety of things that that they could do if they were larger. And just to point out for our local audience here is to remind you that we had this tragic instance of Anton Rose being killed here in the local area, and that was not by the Pittsburgh Police. It was by the East Pittsburgh Police, which is a very small department.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for bringing up that specific instance. We have a few minutes left. And I have a big question that was also submitted by the audience. I'd like to hear what everybody has to say. And this question was from Becca G. And she asks, why are policing discussions so often divorced from justice reform? She asks, don't you think that the tendency to run from the police, resist arrest, etc., is often linked to the overly punitive and very expensive justice system? So I'd like you to address that and address justice reform generally in the context of the other stuff that we've been talking about.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to take a shot, Ben. I mean, I think it's a fallacy to divorce policing from the rest of the criminal legal system. Policing is the wide end of the funnel through which, 10.5 million folks get arrested, and then a certain number, end up going to jail, and then a certain number flow into that system through the prosecutorial system and end up going to prison, where we have 2.2 million people. And so indeed, it is very much part of the system. I think sometimes we talk about it differently. I mean, I will say from my perspective of someone who's run a justice reform organization, is that I mean, how would I put it? In the last 5 to 7 years, I have experienced a pretty profound shift in momentum for justice reform, where I think many Americans who previously were inattentive and malignly negligent of prisons and jails and so on, all of a sudden there's like the great American awakening. We're like, oh my God, look at what we have. And this is unsatisfactory to me. And so there's been a ton of attention on bail, and there's been, attention on just prosecutorial reform and reentry and a wide variety of things. From my perspective, policing is part of that system, but it was a bit of I would say a backwater of backwaters, in the sense that it was a place where there was not a lot of reform momentum. And so it was very hard to get traction to move on that. And so I think as someone who runs an organization that works on a broad range of systems, in fact, about a year ago, we thought about stopping our work on policing because we didn't feel like there was enough traction, that we weren't getting the kind of change that we wanted to see. As someone who runs an organization with very limited capacity, we have to make some choices. I think it's different. And so that's a statement about the political context, the public context, and the ability to achieve goals and significant change. I think that is fundamentally different now. But it is, I am going to say it again, it is a long game. And so maybe that's why the questioner thinks that there's sort of a divorce, but it is all part of the same machine.
To add, to build on what Nick said, I mean, police are actually, vital, can play a vital function in unraveling mass incarceration. And the reason they can play a vital role, along with the support of the various social functions that other people have talked about, is that if you can prevent crime from happening in the first place, you avert not only the social cost of the crime, but you avert having to punish somebody for it. And in their law enforcement mode, and playing the role of the guardian or sentinel that Lori talked about, there's a lot of evidence that police can be effective in preventing crime and therefore preventing imprisonment.
So if I can dig to in a different direction on this, because I think that it's really important that we be honest about, not that to suggest that anybody wasn't, we be honest about the full range of ways this happens. I used to have hair, right? And it used to make me pull out my hair to hear people talk about criminal justice reform and police reform. I was like, what? Why on earth are you making those two things separate? I think it's really important to understand that these reform movements, both the sort of formalized and I talk about the jacket and collar versions of it and the street versions of it, those are networks. It's networks of real people. And in the space of criminal legal reform, it's networks of real people, many of whom, like on this panel, we must like each other, but many of whom have very limited social skills and are not able, even with the people they like, to act like adults around that, to be perfectly blunt. And what that's meant in this context is that we have limited sets of ability to move back and forth between the silos of criminal legal engagement. And so I remember two years ago, I think maybe all of you were at the policing, the Science of Justice conference we put together in DC, the Center for Policing Equity did. And we had folks who were doing reentry work who knew nothing about the decarceration work that was going on, folks who were working on bail reform or pretrial who knew nothing about the policing stuff, and the policing people who knew nothing about any of the downstream stuff. So part of the reason why it's segregated is because there's been a huge focus on mass incarceration, right? And a little bit, those folks, because they deal with justice and folks, have dealt with some of the reentry folks, but the people are separate. There's three things. The second thing to me is, for most of us who get to do this full time, either we care so much about it and we live in these worlds and we live in the vulnerable communities, but most of us have post-secondary degrees. Most of us went to college and we did a little bit of something else. And it's real easy for us to engage with the DA or the public defender who was in our law school classes. It's real easy to deal with the other folks who went to college. It's not nearly so easy to deal with the person who runs a 1,400 person department who has got a GED in their background, right? Like, that's just a harder thing because we don't imagine ourselves into those kind of blue collar lives. And in fact, it's rare that we can imagine that our politics would align, even though for those of us who actually do this work, it often aligns way more than you would think once you get past the labels and the language. So there's a cultural divide between the people who are responsible for keeping that movement stuff alive and who you have to engage with on the ground to do it. And that's made policing to be sort of an outsider in some of this. And then the last piece I would say is it's about money, because oftentimes it's really about money. So the last numbers that I have, which are now super old, remember 2017? I sure don't. But in 2017 was at the time the largest philanthropic investment in criminal legal reform in the nation's history, right? There's about $220 million worth of capital. Now, policing alone is 115 billion, so you understand it's a drop in the bucket. We're nowhere near where we needed to be. But in 2017, to that point, had been the most. And 200 million of that went into direct decarceration efforts, from progressive prosecutors to pretrial to bail to restorative justice. 200 of the 220 million. 10 million went into reentry, 10 million went into policing. Now you show me the community in the United States that experiences the pain of incarceration, the pain of policing as a 20-to-1 issue, and we will ride there on unicorns, because that place does not exist. But we funded it that way. And so it was easy for it to become a throwaway thing. The data weren't there, the people weren't there, the networks weren't there. Now one of the consequences we're reaping is that the folks who are rising up to do public safety work are either entirely detached from the folks who were doing that other criminal legal stuff, right? Or they're folks who were doing the other criminal legal stuff and they're trying to crosswalk over to policing because they're like, oh, that's where the action is. That produces a much less efficient ecosystem for producing change. So in addition to all of this long game that Nick is talking about in terms of the work, there's the work of the ecosystem sort of establishing itself, getting right, and figuring out how to do it. So it's a perceptive question. I would encourage anybody who's listening to the sound of my voice right now, push back every time you hear it. That distinction is a distinction without a difference. And in fact, it's a damaging distinction to try and make.
Thanks, Phil. Lori, any last quick thoughts before we wrap up? We're almost running out of time.
Well, I think my colleagues have said it well. I would only add this, that at the time of the Obama White House task force, we heard a great deal of testimony from community members who felt that while they wanted to talk to us about issues with police, they had greater concerns about the broader criminal justice system. And they wanted us to include in our report concerns and recommendations about that. However, our mandate, our mission was narrower. We did include in our report a recommendation to the president that he appoint a broader task force or commission to look at the entire criminal justice system, because we felt it needed a dramatic change. In the remaining part of President Obama's term, he did not have the bandwidth, I think, and time remaining to do that. But that was something we felt strongly about based on what we were hearing in our hearings around the country and the feedback we were getting. So that really comports with the questioner and with my colleagues' commentary here.
Well, thanks for sharing that perspective, Lori, and thank you for your participation in the panel, and thank you, Dan and Nick and Phil. Thanks very much for sharing some very interesting and important thoughts on public safety, and I think we're just about out of time, so thank you all very much.